This is a download from the BBC. To find out more and for our terms of use, please go to bbc.co.uk. Hello. The great Victorian poet Matthew Arnold wrote of culture and anarchy, and in arguably his most famous poem, Dover Beach, of ignorant armies clashing by night. I wonder what he'd make of this.
I can see a lot of little birds jumping up and down, waiting to be put into the sling. Oh, and the mechanic is very simple, isn't it? You just put your finger onto a bird in a sling. You draw your finger back to pull the sling back, and then when you let it go, the bird flies off.
Well, Radio 4's Front Row thinks it's culture worth celebrating, but only occasionally. Some of our listeners want more, yes, more computer games. And the BBC World Service at 80, a promoter of British values and interests, or a truly independent broadcaster? And are they giving listeners worldwide what they want?
We've got a real problem with this story in that all of our polling on it is that the audiences are bored rigid by American politics. Now, as journalists, we love it because it's, open season circus, and it's a difficult story for us to sell to the audience.
I know the feeling. And many of you are delighted that March has come at last and that Leap for PM, which has been inviting listeners to reveal what they'll be doing on the 29th of February, is over, at least for another 4 years. I'll be asking the editor of PM why she thought it was worth so much airtime, and whether Eddie Mair really can't stand Robert Peston. But first, of all the cuts proposed under the banner of delivering quality first, the unkindest, in the view of many feedback listeners and it would seem the BBC Trust, were those proposed for local radio. The 40 English local radio stations were told by management to lose £15 million by, for example, sharing afternoon programmes with neighbouring stations and by shedding considerable numbers of staff. But those proposals were met with a considerable public outcry, on feedback and beyond. Robin Jones summed up the feelings of many at the time.
I'd really like to ask David Holdsworth, the control of English regions, can he not reconsider that he's going to have shared programming in the afternoon on local radio? I think we would at least need a full radio service between 6 a.m. and 7 p.m. We want that daytime service maintained at a minimum.
The BBC Trust ordered managers to think again about how to make those savings. And to, shall we say, assist the process, an independent report was commissioned from radio consultant John Myers. He rejects the proposal to share afternoon programmes, saying productivity could be increased and that a substantial amount could be saved, £2 million in fact, if stations shared managing editors instead of having one each. David Holdsworth, the head of BBC English Regions, now has to put a revised set of proposals back to the BBC Trust for a final decision. He came into the feedback studio, and we were also joined on the phone by Tamsin Vincent, who co-runs the independent BBC Radio Forum, a listener message board with hundreds of members. I began our discussion by asking her what she thought about John Myers' report.
What specifically jumps out at me is the fact that he has condemned daytime sharing and weekend sharing. He's also set out a clear agenda to protect the frontline staff, and he has said that if cuts do have to be made, they should be smart cuts and not affect output.
Sharing of the afternoon programmes, is it really such a bad thing if it meant more money was available elsewhere?
I think the damage that it would do to local radio would be considerable. And also I have to say that I live in Surrey and Sussex, and one of the networking trials took place in my area, and to be honest, it wasn't local. It didn't seem inclusive, and I stopped listening, and I'm not alone in that.
David Holdsworth, are you heartened by that?
Very much so, because that's the essence of what we do, and I understand the point that has been made most forcibly during the consultation, which is during weekdays, our audiences would like to have a local service. And all the signs are now, given what the Trust has said to us, that we will have the budgets to allow us to do that. And I think that's our role in life. Our role in life is to serve local communities with distinctive, high-quality output.
John Myers is broadly supportive of an all-England programme in the evenings. Do you agree with that?
I think there is something about the local radio audience trying to pull that together across England in a way that reflects their interests, their tastes, their tone, and to discuss subjects that matter to a local radio audience across England that I think could have a bit of power behind it and would have a value.
Do you think that's the case, Tamsin?
No, I think it's frankly ludicrous. Radio England, if you're talking about reflecting, the views of local radio listeners, it is in the word local. If you are going to put something like a Pan-England programme on, you might as well put 5 Live on, because it would save money.
Can we pick up the content first with David Holdsworth? As he said, effectively, there's less than a third of the proposed cuts in content can be implemented without damaging the output. But he also says specifically, I fear there's a deep reluctance to move, presumably with you, David Holdsworth, to move away from having individual managing editors for each station. Although I have not heard any convincing argument why they could not successfully manage a larger portfolio if only 2 stations at a time. Would you like to put forward what you consider to be a convincing argument why you should not implement that?
I'd relish the opportunity, but I'd start by saying he does also say in the report there are a number of ways of cutting management costs, and that is one of them. But I do believe pretty strongly that having an individual editor in most circumstances for our stations is the right way forward. We provide a lot of...
That's what you believe, and he says he's listened to your argument. He hasn't heard a convincing reason for that, so I'm asking you, put forward a convincing reason.
And I was about to. We have 24/7 virtually distinctive output, and that needs a level of editorial scrutiny. You also need somebody to represent the BBC in those communities, and I think most importantly, a lot of the feedback we've had from listeners has been about don't ruin local by making it something where you make decisions from afar. And what the editor does is he understands and talks to local audiences and shapes the schedule and the service in reflection of what the audience are saying to him or her.
So the managing editor's jobs are safe?
Yes.
Do you agree with that, Tamsin?
If there is going to be staff cuts, it would be wrong to cut journalists and foot soldiers. I think that's how Mr. Mars describes them. Rather than a managing editor when there's already an assistant editor. From what I've heard, and certainly, sort of contributors to our forum have said, is that it is often the assistant editor who doesn't run and manage that station. And although I take what David has said, if we're only talking about that managing editor with 1 or 2 or 3 stations, they can still represent in the community. And it would be far more damaging to localness if there were daytime sharing. So I think there's a bit of a contradiction in what he's saying there.
Well, I absolutely agree that management costs is the place we should start in terms of making any savings, and that's what we will do.
And finally, Tamsin, do you have a message for the BBC Trust, which still hasn't pronounced? It's asked the management to look again at the cuts and so on. What's your message for the Trust?
I think they have got to listen to everybody who took part in that consultation, and whether it's sensible to cut BBC local radio at all, and realise that it is very important, and to damage it will damage democracy. And I don't know whether Chris Patten wants to be the chairman who presides over the destruction of local radio. I'm sure he doesn't, and he must realise that listeners do have a right to be heard, and they have a right to hear what's going on in their communities, and he should not take that away.
Tamsin Vincent of the BBC Radio Forum, and David Holdsworth, the head of English regions for the BBC, and a man steering between Scylla and Charybdis. Now for a profound question which would perplex even Plato and Aristotle, and which is hotly debated by feedback listeners. What news is worth broadcasting on the BBC? 2 weeks ago, I tackled the BBC's head of news, Mary Hockaday, over why the resignation of the England football manager and the death of Whitney Houston deserved first billing in some of her news bulletins. Then, last week, a number of you complained that Radio 4's PM programme was devoting far too much time to its February the 29th series, in which listeners outline what they plan to do with their extra day. Eddie Mair sought to increase its appeal by promising to present Wednesday's special programme with Robert Peston.
It's 2 days to go before our Leap for PM this Wednesday, and hundreds of listeners have been telling us about their plans for doing something different.
My name is Michael Franklin. I do feel it's a great pity that such a wonderful programme has come up with some really pretty nutty things. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem content to mention these nutty things just once. It seems to have to beat the drum again and again and again.
Across the UK, people are taking a leap for PM. Sharon, who seems to be sitting next to me and looks a lot like Eddie Mair, runs a coffee bar in Brighton.
After 11 years of running my small cafe, I've decided to take a leap and make it vegetarian. I've been a vegetarian for most of my 47 years, and I've finally had enough of making bacon sandwiches every day.
Mine's Jo Anderson, and I'm from Lancashire. The Leap for PM gave the programme some light, human interest stories. There is the couple where the wife was donating her kidney to her husband. The agoraphobic gentleman catching the bus for the first time in a number of years was absolutely captivating.
My name's Mark Maloney, and I live in Uckfield in East Sussex. I just feel that this is a sort of IPM spin-off which has got into the wrong place. It's not really news, and it seems to be more, dare I say, an ego trip for Eddie Mair.
More about 4 inches,
All right,
says Max.
Max is your tattoo artist.
He is my tattoo artiste, yes.
Artiste. How complicated... By the way, if you're just tuning in, this isn't your radio that's at fault.
My name's Jan Jones and I live in Wrexham in North Wales. We're big fans of Eddie in this house, and when he started doing PM, we felt that he was a breath of fresh air and think he's an excellent interviewer. However, we've become more and more sort of surprised at the amount of comic or human interest stories that are appearing on PM. And the rot seemed to set in, really, around the upshares, downshares time, which was really good fun at the beginning. But, it went on and on and on. We just think he needs, perhaps the editor needs to be a bit stricter and curb his enthusiasm somewhat.
Otherwise we'll blame you.
Robert, thank you very much.
Well, no, it's been a joy to be here. Unfortunately, I've got to dumb down and appear on the television, so I just wanted to say thank you so much for having me.
An absolute pleasure. Let's do it all again in 2016.
Well, the good news is that February the 29th has, of course, passed by and will not return for another 4 years. So will that be the end of such light-hearted, or should we say lightweight, features? Joanna Carr is the editor of PM. I asked her why she thought it was a good idea to do such features in the first place.
The idea was Eddie's directly, and as ever, when we do things on PM, we weren't entirely sure what kind of response we would get from the audience, and what we actually got was quite an overwhelming response.
But perhaps at the beginning, and there are lots of fans who've written to us who say, well, for example, let me quote Jan Jones from Wrexham, "We love Eddie, and at first his lighter style was very welcome, but it seems to us that as time has gone by, he's got carried away and is somewhat overindulged. He is clearly not edited enough. Are you encouraging and indulging him?"
I would be worried if I thought the balance of PM was wrong, but I don't think it is, and I think what Eddie brings to the programme is hugely valued by listeners. And
it is, that's not but the question is whether you've overdone this particular feature. Good joke, repeated too often.
I think there was a sort of logic to this feature to run it for the duration of February. But no, I don't accept that we've overdone it. I think what we've done is every night, with the exception of the day of the 29th and the day after, we have run one feature on this. And usually the audience are very quick to let us know if they think we've got the balance wrong. Some people have said that to you. We've had almost nobody actually contact the programme and let us know. And as I say, usually the audience are quite quick to do so.
Well, let me give you another example. This is just the latest manifestation of Eddie's ill-concealed aspiration to be a king of comedy.
The humour and wit of PM are hugely part of who we are and what we do. But I think you've got to see that in the context of everything else we do. 1 year ago, Hugh Sykes was live in Tahrir Square. Last week, we did an entire feature about unemployment, which we ran across the whole week. So there is a huge balance across PM, and Eddie himself varies his own tone according to what he's doing. Sometimes he is light and humorous, but I think you'd also have to look at some of the amazing right-throughs, for example, he does. That's what we call them, when he lays out for the audience exactly what's happened in Libya or what's happened in Syria and how news has evolved on the government's work programme. And I know you've had your own contacts with listeners, Roger, obviously, but, I just quote you an email that we had from a lady called Oriel Britton, who says, "For what it's worth, I think that Leap for PM is an excellent idea. It goes without saying that murder and mayhem are very serious and should always be made a priority in a news programme, but not to the exclusion of all else. The lighter, quirkier, oddly moving moments of life deserve their airtime too."
Nobody would disagree. They would question some that whether it should be in a news programme or not. Finally, can I ask you about Eddie Mair and Robert Peston? Do they really not get on? I know they co-presented the programme on last Wednesday night, but they're pretty prickly when they're in the same studio. Is there something going on there?
I think we've established to our satisfaction that the feud was entirely Robert's fault, and it was entirely Robert who perpetuated it, and we at PM are extremely glad that he has now had the sense to come to the microphone bearing an olive branch and the huge amount of expertise that he brings as the BBC's business editor.
Joanna Carr. Whoops, the phone's just rung. I bet you that's Robert Peston wanting a right to reply. Anyway, thanks to all of you who got in touch with your thoughts, good and bad, about that programme. Please contact me about anything else you've heard on Radio 4 or on any other BBC radio station, which you think is worth bringing to our attention. You can write to feedback at PO Box 67234, London SE1P 4AX, or you can leave a phone message on 03 333 444 544. Standard landline charges apply, but it could cost more on some mobile networks. Or, of course, you can email feedback@bbc.co.uk. All those details are on our website. It's celebration time at the BBC World Service, which is marking, or should I say marketing, its 80th birthday. It has plenty to celebrate. Arabic audiences have increased by 50% since the start of the Arab Spring, and audiences for World Service news in Iran are up by 85%. 43 million people listen to the World Service in English, more than 1.5 million of those in the UK alone. So this week, the World Service cleared the Bush House car park, erected a vast hospitality tent, rigged it with lights, invited in the cameras and the microphones, and celebrated with a day of special programmes. Audiences around the world were invited to get in touch to discuss what they want and don't want to hear from the service. As the hot lights shone down and microphones on poles appeared under their noses, the editors discussed what stories they might cover that day.
All day long, the BBC is marking 80 years of international broadcasting.
The meeting was chaired by Oleksiy Solohubenko, multimedia editor of the BBC World Service Languages.
Welcome to everyone. The purpose of this meeting is very, very simple. We're trying to shape the BBC Global News agenda for 225 million people around the world.
The dire situation in Syria was the first thing to be discussed, but it wasn't the top story of the day.
Michael Duncan is editor of the Newsroom Today. What are we leading with now?
Yeah, at the moment we're leading on the results from Michigan and Arizona.
With 8 months still to go, many feedback listeners are already fed up with hearing about the American election on the domestic services. I hope it's a comfort to know that you're not alone.
We've got a real problem with this story in that all of our polling on it is that the audiences are bored rigid by American politics. Now, as journalists, we love it because it's, open season circus, and it's people say outrageous things, but it's a difficult story for us to sell to the audience.
In fact, not all the journalists at the meeting were convinced that selling the story to the audience was worth doing, particularly if it was the audience in Africa.
This story in America, is it not too local, and why do we keep on going on about it? Would we do the same if, say, it were happening in Nigeria, for instance?
My name's Penny Roscoe. I listen to a lot of Radio 4 and the World Service. I was very interested to hear what the African editor had to say, particularly about the American elections and how people in Africa were not interested in them, which I wholeheartedly agree with. It would be really interesting to hear more from Africa.
Our listeners do like international news, but only this American primaries is the one a little bit too much.
You've said it twice. Josephine, tell us what is your top story in Africa, please?
Okay, people in that eastern DR Congo have been, since the elections in December, streaming out of the country in little numbers.
After the meeting and the broadcast ended, I talked to one of the participants, Steve Titherington, Senior Commissioning Editor of Global News. Surely the thing is that you are telling people what is important, not necessarily what they want to hear. So how do you balance what they think they want to know with what you can see coming down the line, which is going to be terribly important?
Isn't the best thing to be able to combine the two? I think there's a really testing thing about what is important, and to have that dialogue with the audience, which you could not have in the same way before, just because the technology didn't allow it.
So now, you listen to in other words, you're listening to the customer a lot more.
You're listening to the customer in a sense because the customer is there with you on these stories, which didn't happen before. You would broadcast when I started here 20 years ago, and you may or may not receive some communication some weeks after. Now it's instant. Now, I would say that, curiously, I don't think it's hugely changed the nature of the journalism we do, but it does make us think a lot harder about the way we tell those stories and about the way we're involving people.
Hello, you're listening to The World Today with Tom Hagler and Matt McGrath.
I listen to a lot of Radio 4, and domestic news I find is very Westminster and increasingly celebrity-based, which tends to be a bit repetitive. Sudan and the famine in the Horn of Africa seems to have completely gone off the agenda. The Oscars also took up a lot of time. The World Service News, I find, looks behind the issues a lot more and often looks at problems in different countries from a slightly different angle, which I find is often much more interesting.
We're trying to find somebody who will talk to us openly about the predicament, if you like, of the Red Crescent in Syria and how openly it can carry out its mission.
Thank you. I think that's a great angle, actually, and
I'm concerned that the World Service, when it moves out of Bush House and becomes part of the overall BBC News team, will stop the way it looks at the news differently, which I think would be a great pity.
The World Service is already beginning to leave Bush House, its home since 1941, and moving in with the rest of the BBC News teams in Broadcasting House. The aim is to create the world's newsroom. But what if Penny's fears that the World Service news agenda may narrow as a result? Steve Titherington again.
We have a big audience in the UK. Over 1.5 million who regularly listens to us, and that's an important audience to us. And my feeling is that if we're telling stories to the world, then, the UK is part of the world. And they're interested in getting that perspective.
A lot of people have said that one of the worries is if you switch on it, say on BBC News throughout the day, the domestic services, the same stories rumble on. There's a whole raft of stories out there that aren't being touched. Is there a real chance that the World Service, being in the same newsroom as the domestic services, will widen the agenda of the domestic services?
I would hope having us there would actually be, a huge help, and I actually think it will be good for us to be able to sort of be out there and explain ourselves and in a way sell our approach as well.
Who used to work here, he says this doesn't sound much like editorial meetings I attended. Far too polite. And
Happy 80th birthday, BBC World Service. Lepreci tweeted to say what a great idea it was to open up the newsroom. Can Radio 4 be persuaded to do the same, he asks. Now, when was the last time you pwned some noobs? Do you know your FPS from your RPG? No, me neither. And if Front Row is the font of all your cultural knowledge, then you and I can be forgiven for not being completely switched on when it comes to computer games. However, last Friday, Front Row did devote an entire edition to the subject, and about time too, according to some of our listeners.
My name's Ian Thomas, and I'm calling from Cardiff. I just wanted to say thanks, Radio 4, for featuring Naomi Alderman's Front Row special on computer games. More of this sort of thing, please. It's much more relevant to what's going on in the creative industries than a great deal of what's currently on Front Row. Bearing in mind BAFTA's commitment to treat games, TV and film equally, Front Row should really be updated to follow suit.
They run companies worth hundreds of millions of pounds and make games played by tens of millions of people around the world. They're our major cultural export, so why aren't we talking about them?
My name's Leo Vagoda, and I'm from London. I would like to see BBC Radio 4 incorporate games into its cultural output in the same way it reports on books, music, theatre and cinema. It was very clear from the report that games have as much variety as other media, touch a large and growing proportion of the population, and often absorb people for considerably longer than books, theatre or cinema. Will this be the start of gaming being integrated into Radio 4's cultural coverage?
When I go and talk to literary novelists about games, quite a lot of literary people about games, and I constantly say, this is not a new thing. We're going back to campfire storytelling. I think you're right.
My name's Louise Stoll and I live in London. Listening to the programme was a bit of a revelation. So I haven't played video games since I was about 10, and it really sort of opened my eyes to the possibilities, both in terms of actually wanting to play them, and I feel like me and my wife are going to go out and actually possibly get a PlayStation, but also I think that there's just a lot of scope to talk about it on Radio 4's programmes, both literary and cultural programmes.
John Gowdy is the editor of Front Row. I asked him what sort of response he'd had.
I think what's very interesting, the response we got to the programme, we got a lot of very enthusiastic emails, and yes, inevitably we got people saying, this is games, not art. But we felt that there was enough to talk about in terms of talking to writers, in terms of talking to the people who create the games, in the same way that we might talk to someone who creates a film or creates the special effects on a film. We felt there was enough in there that matched our usual agenda. So we weren't actually talking technology or in detail about the industry and the finances, but we felt there were enough creative people we could talk to sustain a half-hour programme.
Well, as you know from our listeners anyway, it's been very well received, giving you the thumbs up. But some have said, aren't you a bit late here? Because BAFTA's been giving prizes to the games industry since 2003, and listener Ian Thomas says, why haven't you followed suit? You're a bit slow.
Well, I can't pretend it's been an absolutely fundamental part of our agenda, but we have reviewed a number of major games. We've interviewed the man who founded Nintendo. We've in fact covered things like the BAFTA for game soundtracks.
But your very own presenter of the special programme, Naomi Alderman, said video games haven't received the recognition enjoyed by other arts. Do you agree with that, and why, if that is the case?
I half agree with that. I mean, I have to say, and I think Naomi would be the first to admit it, she has reviewed a number of games on our programme. I think what's very interesting about games is if you look at the battlefield games, the sports games, the fitness games, a lot of them for us, they don't offer many opportunities for in-depth discussion. A number of the games are sequels. And what we're always looking for in whatever we cover is we need to be able to have an intelligent conversation that will appeal to a wider audience than just the gamers. We got a very interesting email, in fact, from a listener who said, we in the programme, and in fact in the games we've reviewed in the past, games like L.A. Noire, which is a sort of evokes 1940s Los Angeles, the world of the private eye, Raymond Chandler, Red Redemption, this is a Wild West game. And this listener pointed out that these are very much narrative-driven games. And so in a way, they're very similar to things we normally talk about, films, books. And he was saying, well, perhaps we should be bolder and talk about non-narrative games.
Do you accept his argument?
I think it would very much depend on the game and what there is for us to discuss.
Of course, it's all terribly influenced by the editor himself or herself and what she reads and does and whatever. Do you play computer games?
I play some games on my phone, but I do have children who are very interested in games. So vicariously, I see the games and I'm aware of how popular and successful they are, but I can't say that I'm a great player of FIFA 12.
John Gowdy, the editor of Front Row, promising to play more games. Well, I'm off to lock on to a combo move. Now, if I press this, what happens? Robert Peston. But first, of all the cuts proposed under the banner of delivering quality first, the unkindest, in the view of many feedback listeners and it would seem the BBC Trust, were those proposed for local radio. The 40 English local radio stations were told by management to lose £15 million by, for example, sharing afternoon programmes with neighbouring stations and by shedding considerable numbers of staff. But those proposals were met with a considerable public outcry, on feedback and beyond. Robin Jones summed up the feelings of many at the time.
I'd really like to ask David Holdsworth, the controller of English regions, can he not reconsider that he's going to have shared programming in the afternoon on local radio? I think we would at least need a full radio.
Yes, more computer games. And the BBC World Service at 80, a promoter of British values and interests or a truly independent broadcaster? And are they giving listeners worldwide what they want?
We've got a real problem with this story in that all of our polling on it is that the audiences are bored rigid by American politics. Now, as journalists, we love it because it's, open season circus, and it's a difficult story for us to sell to the audience.
I know the feeling. And many of you are delighted that March has come at last and that Leap for PM, which has been inviting listeners to reveal what they'll be doing on the 29th of February, is over, at least for another 4 years. I'll be asking the editor of PM why she thought it was worth so much airtime, and whether Eddie Mair really can't stand BBC Radio Forum, a listener message board with hundreds of members. I began our discussion by asking her what she thought about John Meyer's report.
What specifically jumps out at me is the fact that he has condemned daytime sharing and weekend sharing. He's also set out a clear agenda to protect the frontline staff. And he has said that if cuts do have to be made, they should be smart cuts and not affect output.
Sharing of the afternoon programmes, is it really such a bad thing if it meant more money was available elsewhere?
I think the damage that it would do to local radio would be considerable. And also I have to say that I listen in...
This is a download from the BBC. To find out more and for our terms of use, please go to bbc.co.uk. Hello. The great Victorian poet Matthew Arnold wrote of culture and anarchy, and in arguably his most famous poem, Dover Beach, of ignorant armies clashing by night. I wonder what he'd make of this.
I can see a lot of little birds jumping up and down, waiting to be put into the sling. Oh, and the mechanic is very simple, isn't it? You just put your finger onto a bird in a sling. You draw your finger back to pull the sling back, and then when you let it go, the bird flies off.
Well, Radio 4's Front Row thinks it's culture worth celebrating, but only occasionally. Some of our listeners want more, yeah.
Service between 6 a.m. and 7 p.m. We want that daytime service maintained at a minimum.
The BBC Trust ordered managers to think again about how to make those savings. And to, shall we say, assist the process, an independent report was commissioned from radio consultant John Myers. He rejects the proposal to share afternoon programmes, saying productivity could be increased and that a substantial amount could be saved, £2 million in fact, if stations shared managing editors instead of having one each. David Holdsworth, the head of BBC English Regions, now has to put a revised set of proposals back to the BBC Trust for a final decision. He came into the feedback studio, and we were also joined on the phone by Tamsin Vincent, who co-runs the independent